I plan to talk about the energy, the very thing that he's talking about. And just go back and look logically. If we are dependent upon fossil fuels for 75% of our ability to run this machine called America, and we extract that, what's going to happen? I think we all know what's going to happen, and I think people need to be forewarned. The reason that I'm going to tee this up by talking a little bit about President Obama's climate assessment meeting that he had yesterday, with dancing in all these people talking about the world coming to an end. The report that he came out with. Well, let me first of all ask unanimous consent at the conclusion of my remarks that the senator from Delaware, Senator Coons, be recognized.
Without objection.
Yeah, the whole idea of this report by design is to spark fear in the American people so they'll go along with the administration in implementing their policies that will kill fossil fuels and leave us with nothing but a broken economy. And when I say broken economy, if in fact, and it is, no one would refute this, we are dependent upon fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, for 75% of the energy to run America, then what's going to happen to our economy if we extract 75%? Well, I think we all know logically what's going to happen. In the words of the White House counselor, John Podesta, this morning, he said quote, the American public doesn't feel that sense of urgency about the impacts of climate change, and I think this report will help influence that. Well, that is nothing but an admission. The whole reason for this report is to try to resurrect the issue of global warming. And we heard my good friend from Massachusetts talking about that. He's very knowledgeable, and I'll refer to some of his activities in just a minute. But keep in mind, this is John Podesta. He's the same John Podesta that's representing some of the terrorist regime from Sri Lanka that is no longer in effect. He's the same one that ran the White House during the Clinton years. So he comes from a very partisan perspective. But nonetheless, I appreciate the fact that he's admitting that this is the reason for the climate assessment that President Obama did yesterday, because he wants to try to bring this up again, because the people, I can remember back when the polling showed that global warming was in either number 1 or number 2 of the environmental issues in America. You know where it is, Madam President, now? It's number 10, according to the last Gallup poll. So people have forgotten about it. People have caught on. They've seen the scientists come in and refute all this IPCC stuff that the United Nations have been putting forth for a long period of time. So I think that it's a recognition that people have caught on to this, and it's no longer the issue that they want it to be. Now, whether it's a drought or a flood, high temperatures, low temperatures, if you can't find a job, you're having more allergic reactions, then the White House blames the problem on global warming. Fear has always been a tactic of the administration, and other global warming alarmists have used to spur people into action. But time and time again, when the American people learn the details and the costs of the solutions to global warming that they contend exists, they don't want anything to do with them. And the costs are enormous. Congress last debated the global warming when my good friend, now Senator Markey, was in the House. It was the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill. Now, this bill would have cost, according to Charles Rivers and Associate, and I think people recognize them as authentic, between $300 and $400 billion a year. That's the cost. I would contend this would be the largest tax increase in the history of this country. Now, that's consistent with with other analyses. One was the Wharton Group. Many of the scientists there that were making evaluations came out with the same thing, between $300 and $400 billion a year. MIT came out with about the same amount, $300 to $400 billion a year. Now, the cost estimate has been the same over the last 15 years since we first started debating this issue, and I don't think anyone is challenging that. But what is really important, and that's kind of in the weeds, but we have to talk about this. I applaud Senator Markey for at least the levels of pollution, of emissions, I should say, that come from different sources that he was wanting to regulate, and that was those with 25,000 tons of CO2 emissions or more. Now that would be, quite frankly, the major emitters. That would be the refineries and all of that. Here's the problem we have today. It's far worse than the Waxman-Markey bill would have been, because it wouldn't call for the regulation of just those entities that emit 25,000 tons or more, but copy the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act has a threshold of 250 tons of greenhouse gases a year. Now you stop and think about that. If it costs between $300 and $400 billion to regulate emitters who regulate 25,000 tons of CO2 a year, how much more if it would just regulate everyone with 250 tons? It's never been calculated. It'd be very difficult. But we're talking about billions and billions of dollars more. And so the regulations are far worse. The first of these regulations now being developed right now is the new source performance standards for newly constructed power plants. The rule would essentially make it illegal to build new coal-fired power plants. That was what it was designed to do. Now, the next step would be to take the existing power plants, those that are employing hundreds of thousands of people in America today, and they would be out of a job. So that would go to the refining industry and so forth, and establish new regulations for each and every industry. These greenhouse gas regulations mark the latest attempt by the EPA to destroy affordable and reliable electricity and energy supplies that have been the hallmark of our economy for a long period of time. But they're already doing it in other areas too. It's not just regulating the greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 emissions, it's other regulations that are unbearable. Listen right here, they're talking about changing the ozone regulation. Now this chart's an interesting one, because this shows that virtually every county in America would be out of attainment with their new goals. In my state of Oklahoma, we have 77 counties. All 77 counties would be out of attainment if they're able to do that. In 2011, the EPA finalized its utility MACT. By the way, MACT, M-A-C-T, that's Maximum Achievable Control Technology. That's what we're talking about. So they passed, and it's now, it is passed, it's history now, utility MACT, a rule that costs over $100 million and will result in 1.65 million lost jobs. Now, the EPA put this rule out without even considering the cost of it, saying that it wasn't required to do so. In other words, the law does not say that they're required to say what it costs. I take issue with that. They estimated the rule would result in the retirement of less than 10,000 megawatts of electricity generation, but today we know that the power companies around the country have announced retirements of totaling more than 50,000. So they're off by 500%. Of the 50,000 megawatts in direct response to the EPA regulation. By the way, when we had the utility MACT, I filed at CRA, and this is something I want to make sure that people are aware of, and that certainly my colleagues, my friends on the other side of the aisle, that on all these regulations, when they once reach the point where the regulation is final, and we know for a fact that it's going to cost dollars and it's going to cost jobs, I'm going to file a CRA. A CRA is a Congressional Review Act. The CRA it provides that if there's a regulation, and I hear so often members of my colleagues in the Senate will say to their constituents, "Don't blame me for these regulations because that's the regulatory, that's the EPA and other regulators doing it." But a CRA forces them to take an issue. So all you have to do is find 30 people in the United States Senate, have them sign a CRA, file the CRA, and then it's simply a simple majority, 51. Well, in the case of this utility MACT that we had, I only lacked 3 votes of stopping that rule. So we anticipate we're going to be able to stop a lot of these rules. In about 10 days, the EPA is poised to propose another new rule. It's the 316B cooling water intake rule. This rule is designed to protect fish from being caught and killed in nets designed to prevent them from entering power plant systems. And while the rule doesn't have any human health benefits, it is expected to cost industry over $100 billion in compliance costs, which, of course, we have passed on to the people, everyone in America who ends up paying for these bills. The North American Electric Reliability Corp., that's called NERC, has warned that this rule will have far worse impact on electricity affordability and reliability than the Utility Act did. We know what that did. In fact, the Federal Energy, the FERC commissioner recently said that because EPA's rules, the United States is likely to see rolling electricity blackouts during the summer months in just the next few years as demand for electricity outstrips the supply remaining after all of the power plant shutdowns that are slated to occur in response to the EPA rules. The EPA has been systematically distorting the true cost of its regulations in years, and I have been raising this as an issue for some time now, but it's been very difficult to air them out before the entire Senate, simply because at this point, the sole goal of the Democrats seems to be to protect their majority. Now, if we look at this chart here, this was back prior to the 2012 election. And what we found they were doing prior to the 2012 election is postponing many of these very onerous regulations because they knew that we would be doing a CRA and the public would know who is responsible for these. And they had postponed this. This is what a report that I put out, October of 2012. And that was to try to force the administration to not wait until after the election to come out with their rules. And that's what they did. Well, they're doing it again now. Last week, I released documents revealing that the EPA intentionally delayed the release of its greenhouse gas new source performance standards, that's NSPS, and delay them for 66 days in order to avoid it being finalized before the midterm elections. The same thing as 2012. I also sent a letter to Gina McCarthy, who is the director of the Environmental Protection Agency, asking why the rule was delayed, especially when she had previously told me that it was a result of a backlog in the Federal Register. In other words, she's saying, well, the Federal Registry did not post this thing until 66 days after we gave it to them. Well, we checked with the Federal Register. They said that's absolutely false. They have an immediate turnaround for these rules. And so now I'm waiting for a response to that letter. I don't want to use the L word. I don't want to, I know that there's a lot of pressure put on the employees and certainly the director of the EPA to try to minimize what the public feels is going to be the cost of these regulations. Now, had the EPA stuck with its original timeline of finalizing this rule by September 20th of this year, that would be, then I would have been able to work with my colleagues to force a Congressional Review Act to overturn the rule just weeks before the election. Then people would know the cost of these things. But what we could do right now is vote on a few of the amendments. Our senator from Missouri was talking about these amendments. We have a bill that's coming up. We have amendments that should be considered, all having to do with energy. So they're all appropriate amendments to offer, as he articulated for about 10 minutes a few minutes ago. The first, and I have some amendments that would do this. He mentioned one of them because he and I are together, but one of my amendment is 2977. That's 2977, Senate amendment, would be entitled the Energy Tax Prevention Act of 2014. It simply prohibits the EPA from promulgating any greenhouse gas emissions to combat climate change, because they're denying that this is the reason they're doing it, and because we know what has happened to the science that they're relying on through the United Nations that's now been refuted. The second amendment that I have is amendment number 2979. It would prevent the EPA from issuing any new Clean Air Act regulations like those on climate change until it complies with Section 321A of the Clean Air Act. Now, let's keep in mind, this is the Clean Air Act. We're talking about decades ago. And this is what the Environmental Protection Agency is supposed to do. The administrator shall conduct continuing evaluations of potential loss or shifts of employment which may result from the administration or enforcement of the provision of this chapter. It is saying that they're supposed to already tell the public what the cost, in terms of jobs and in money. That's the law, but they're not obeying the law. So I have an amendment that puts teeth in it and says you can't have any new rules until you comply with the existing Section 321A of the Clean Air Act. Very reasonable, and that's the law today. Unfortunately, the EPA is not interested in doing this. With the utility MAC, it's completely dismissed the rule's cost, and it didn't consider it when putting off the rule. The EPA acted in contradiction to the Supreme Court precedents that decision makers are required to weigh advantages against disadvantages, and disadvantages can be seen in terms of cost. That's the United States Supreme Court.
Senator is consumed 15 minutes.
I ask unanimous consent that I be given 5 more minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Now, I've got to get to the last part, rather than to face these issues head on, I'm going to share with you something that happened last year and then again this year. There's a very wealthy person named Tom Steyer. Tom Steyer has a mansion that overlooks Golden Gate Bridge, and he had a fundraiser for Barack Obama last year, raising a lot of money. But the one I'm more concerned about is the fundraiser that he had when he announced, and this is just in the last month, Tom Steyer, a very wealthy person, said that he was going to personally donate $50 million and raise an additional $50 million to try to do 2 things. One, to resurrect this whole idea on global warming, since the people don't care about it anymore. And as a result of that, we had an all-night vigil. You remember that? That was right after Tom Steyer made his announcement. And the second thing that he's mandating is to kill the Keystone Pipeline. So there's a lot of money out there. The regulatory burdens already being placed in this country are enormous, and I've long said that the cost of regulations are worse, perhaps arguably the worst problem facing this country. Last week, the Competitive Enterprise Institute published a major report calculating the cost of the president's regulations at $1.86 trillion. Now, to put that in a perspective, the Canada's entire GDP is $1.82 trillion, the same amount. India's is the same amount. So that's what the cost would be according to the Competitive Enterprise Institute. So people know what's happened with this administration to the military. They know what's happened to to energy, but the cost of these regulations is something that's going to have to be attracted. Now, lastly, I would say this. I know there are people out there that legitimately believe that greenhouse gases are causing global warming and the world's going to come to an end. But I would suggest this. Lisa Jackson was the administrator chosen by Barack Obama, the first administrator that we had for the EPA. I asked her this question on the record, live on TV. I said, Madam Administrator, if we were to pass either the bills like the Markey-Waxman bill or do by regulation, regulating the CO2 in the United States of America, would this have the effect of lowering the CO2 emissions worldwide? She said no, because this is not where the problem is. It's in China, it's in India, it's in Mexico. In other words, if you believe, as I do not believe, but if you believe that CO2 is going to bring about the end of the world, then even if we do something in this country, it's not going to solve the problem. Arguably, it would make the problem worse, because as we lose our manufacturing base, as they're out seeking electricity and energy from countries where they don't have any of these regulations, that would have the effect of increasing, not decreasing, emissions of CO2. And with that, Madam President, I'll yield the floor, and I thank my friend for not objecting for my additional time.